Welcome to the SRS Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron J. Babyar, and I'm the Training Director of Support Raising Solutions. Whether you're a new ministry worker or a veteran looking to increase your competence and confidence, Support Raising Solutions seeks to bless you in your quest to be a spiritually healthy, vision-driven, fully funded Great Commission worker. My guest today is Andrew Nobauer. Of course, Andrew has been a on-again, off-again wonderful guest of the SRS podcast. And Andrew works with CCO, and he's been a part of the SRS network pretty much from its inception, I think. Andrew, you've been around for a while, and you, of course, live in Canada, and you got a family, so I think people who listen to past episodes will know a little bit about you. But why don't you share with our wonderful podcast listeners one or two things about you that perhaps we haven't mentioned? It could just be some random stuff, but tell us one or two interesting things about Andrew Nobauer that most people might not already know.
Sure. So, right now, the big news in Canada is, of course, the NHL playoffs. And I'm very happy to report that the Vancouver Canucks have advanced to the second round. And not only that, but their rookie phenom, Quinn Hughes, has a point a game as a defenseman. So needless to say, I am now teaching my kids how to chant, "Go Canucks, go," and we might be naming our next child Quinn. Not that we're expecting, but I've kind of already started to start that discussion with my wife. And then
you've heard it here first. Then Mrs. Nobauer is officially pregnant.
No, definitely not. And then also with COVID, all of kind of like our gyms and all that kind of stuff is shut down. And so one exciting thing for me is I actually drywalled and insulated my garage and bought a home gym setup. So I'll actually be able to work out at home,
nice.
Which is one of the more exciting things going on in my life right now. I'm very excited to kind of get that all set up and start being able to exercise regularly again.
Well, next time you and I are physically together, God willing, in 2021, I expect you to be ripped, my friend.
Sounds
just absolutely ripped.
Perfect. That's the plan too. But sometimes the children, might not necessarily want to cooperate with that when they wake up in the middle of the night.
Yeah. And remind me, are your kids 1 and 3? Is that their ages currently?
Yes, that's good. But they actually, so it's birthday season. So my son just turned 2 last week, and then my daughter will be turning 4 next week.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for joining us again. Of course, I have invited you to come on and speak about a topic that, quite honestly, if people already noticed it in the title, they might have clicked off already. However, we do need to talk about policy. Yes, my friends, policy is actually something that as support raisers, we probably have to engage with in some way, shape, or form with our host organization. Now, you might be the sort of listener that you're starting your own nonprofit, or perhaps you're in an organization that doesn't have any policy and really needs policy when it comes to the area of ministry partner development. But that's part of why we wanted to talk about it today. We have found that policy can sometimes really encourage healthy support raising practices, and it sometimes can discourage it, or the lack of healthy policy can discourage it. And Andrew has been raising and living off support himself for many years, but also he oversees others who raise and live off support. So Andrew, when we get to this idea of policy, I know a lot of people, myself included, my first thought is, red tape, bureaucracy, no thank you, I'm out. Help those of us that kind of have a bad attitude when we think about policy. Help us think about that a little bit differently when it comes to this topic.
Yeah, for sure. It's no one's favorite topic, except for maybe me. And hopefully after this, hopefully after this podcast, some of our listeners as well. When I give talks on policy, at our new staff training, generally speaking, I think I can probably count the seconds until everyone's eyes are kind of glazed over. But it's something that I've really discovered through a lot of application of policy, working in policy, that your policy is going to make and break your call to staff in your organization. If you have a healthy policy that promotes healthy practices, you're gonna thrive in your ministry because you're gonna know what's expected of you. And if you have an unhealthy policy that you're coming up against, then that is really important to know, because then you're able to lead up in your organization, be a 360-degree leader, and help to influence and change your organization. So not only can your life be better in your support raising, but all of those who come after you, their life and their calling in the ministry will be better too.
Right, right. So let's dig in on a couple different areas here. One that I can get a little bit too passionate about because I've seen this abused. So I actually don't want to speak on this. Just want to ask you about it, and I'm going to try and remain somewhat mum. But this idea that an organization, its best policy is to have no policy and just let everybody pick their own speed and do whatever they want when it comes to support raising. Why does, more often than not, why does that just fail and end up ultimately hurting the vision of the ministry?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Aaron. Clear expectations are one of the things that probably everybody longs for when you're working, right? You want to know what is clearly expected of you, and you want to be able to treat everybody equitably, right? You want all of your staff to have the kind of the same standards. I think nothing kills an organization further, or even staff health further, than if Sally Sue gets treated one way and Bob gets treated another way.
Mm-hmm.
You want to make sure that you're being consistent with how you're treating your staff, making sure that they're properly cared for, making sure that nobody is kind of getting treated unfairly compared to somebody else. And also, I mean, from a purely organizational perspective, like, you don't want to open yourself up for lawsuit, right? Like, you don't want to be sued because you gave somebody 8 months and then let them go because for whatever reason, and then you gave somebody else 12 months and they were able to stick around, right? So having clear policy allows you to treat your staff fairly. So for staff health wise and staff care, they can be properly cared for because they know what's expected of them. They know how the organization is going to treat them. And then on an organizational level, it protects your organization, because then you're not opening yourself up for a lot of HR complaints.
Now, for our listeners that aren't in, we'll say, executive type positions, this still pertains to you. By way of example, if you're fresh out of college, you're single, you don't have kids, you have very little or no debt. The reality is, to raise your full funding, it will probably not take you as long as someone who's married, has 4 or 5 kids, has a mortgage, has a lot more financial need because a lot more mouths are being fed. And the odds are that your organization probably needs slightly different policies regarding the expectations of how quickly you get fully funded, how much it takes to be considered fully funded, and a host of other variables. And so it's good for an organization to be thinking through these things. But for you as someone who's kind of on the team, you're not necessarily setting policy. We want you to don't too quickly dismiss the idea that, a policy is just, someone didn't think about that. The odds are probably pretty high that someone came up with that policy because someone else went before you and that policy didn't exist, and the lack of it hurt them and or the ministry. So I think Andrew, you would agree for us to say that we want to, as new support raisers, we want to encourage people to, first of all, assume that the policies that are put in place by the host ministry organization that you're working with, those were put there to help you, not to try and hold you back.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the first step when you're coming into the organization is you want to trust your leadership. You want to trust that they have the best intentions for you. I'm not saying that the rules will maybe be the best, but what I want to say is that you're coming into a Christian organization, Great Commission minded, that has the same goals as you. You want to start with your best foot forward, and you want to trust that your leadership has thought these through, and that these rules are there for a reason. And if you maybe disagree with them, that really is okay. But you want to make sure that when you're talking to them about it, that you talk to them about it in a way that is respectful, and in a way that is maybe removed from the situation at hand.
Yeah. And so And you said something a while back, which actually is partly what led me to asking you to be on this podcast, where you said that policy is one of the best ways that an organization can care for people. And I know a lot of us, when we think of rules and regulations, well, that's not caring. That's just out to get me. I mean, maybe not everybody thinks that way. Maybe it's just me. But we want people to understand that it actually is a very caring thing for your organization to say, no, 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 don't just go at whatever speed you want. Don't just do this whatever way you want. People have gone before you, and we have come up with something that we think is fair and equitable, and it's going to help you move towards being spiritually healthy, vision driven, and fully funded. And so we don't want people to just dismiss policy. We want you to yeah, like Andrew, like you said, trust it, accept it, but we're not saying don't think critically about it. And that's probably a good segue. So for people that, we kind of just talked to people that are going into an organization that has some policy. Let's kind of flip that. What about people that are going to an organization? It does have policy, but they're realizing maybe some of those policies aren't so great, or perhaps they're a bit antiquated, or they're not working. What do we say to those listeners, Andrew?
Yeah, for sure. So I think one of the first things, and I should have done this at the start of the podcast, is go to scripture. And one of the things that the verses that always comes to me when I'm thinking about policy in particular, or just maybe more structural things, is Hebrews 12. In the latter half, in the latter half of first half actually of Hebrews 12, where it says, "Discipline always seems painful rather than pleasant at the time, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." Or even further, or earlier, when it kind of says, or not kind of says, when it says, "My child, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, or lose heart when you are punished by him. For the Lord disciplines those whom he loves, and chastises every child whom he accepts." Now, those are heavy passages, but when we look into those passages, we see that discipline brings about structure, and brings about, when it's hard, but it brings about the peaceful fruit of righteousness. And so when we come into the organization, we want to come into the understanding that these rules and these policies are designed for our best, like the intention of is that they would be designed for the best intention of the support raiser, that they would be helping that staff member in their call to the mission. Now, maybe the policy doesn't live up to that, and that happens. Policies need to be reviewed, and sometimes policies need to be changed based on lived experience. I've had to do that in CCO, where we found that a policy wasn't actually achieving its intended purpose, and so we deleted it or changed it so that it would actually bring about the function that we would want. And I would say, if you're a staff member that you're going into this organization, the first thing I would do is actually take time to read through the policy.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we would go into the organization, then all of a sudden we come up against the policy, and we don't like it. And so then our initial reaction is negative. And it's mostly because we're caught by surprise, or maybe we feel even a little bit guilty about not living up to the standards that the organization set. And so we kind of say, oh, well, that's unfair. But then we kind of remember back to our orientation where they said, oh, make sure you read our policy regarding all of these things.
Right.
And we didn't maybe look through the policy as closely as we should have. And I think before you're going into a support raising season, you want to make sure that you look over your MPD policies, and think to yourself, okay, well, is there anything here that I should be surprised by? Is there anything here that I didn't know about? And you want to take note of those things, because there's nothing worse than being on a support raising interval and being caught by surprise. So an example would be, CCO. We tell people, you're not allowed to ask our students directly out of campus to support you. And the reason that we've had that is because we've had a student graduate, and we've had like 5 people ask to support or ask that student to support them as soon as they got a job, right? Which, I mean, it left a poor taste in the mouth of that student, because they kind of felt like they were an ATM, and that all of these staff members just kind of pounced on them as soon as they graduated. And and so CCO put a policy in place that said, you can't ask students. And in the rare circumstance where you feel that you should be asking a student to support you, that's okay. But you have to first talk to your support raising coach and explain why. And then you have to talk to the campus team leader that would be on that serve that campus, to make sure that they also think that it's appropriate that you would ask this person. And once those two people have checked and said, yes, like we can do that, then you can feel free to approach them. And then that prevents 5 people, 6 people from asking that person. Right. And I had a situation where I had to say to somebody, like, you're not supposed to be asking these people. And they got mad at me. And I realized, like, maybe we need to make this a little bit more clear in the policy, or maybe I don't want to interpret on his end, but maybe he didn't look as clearly in the policy as he should have.
Right. And so just for the listener, just to be clear, it's not that CCO was trying to keep someone from being invited to be a part of the kingdom work they're doing. They're trying to preserve the relationships. They're trying not to overwhelm. They had some experience regarding, people going through transitions in life and all of a sudden being overwhelmed or whatever else. And so they're trying to bring some clarity and good communication and just kind of honoring people well by putting this policy together.
Exactly.
Someone who's coming in, I could see, Andrew, why they'd be upset with you, or with someone and go, hey, don't tell me who I can ask and I can't ask. And generally speaking, that might be true. But in this sort of unique situation, the organization saw, wow, maybe the best way to move forward is to add a little bit of policy here to kind of preserve everybody. So because you don't want to be the person who's asked 15 different times from the same organization by 15 different people, but also you don't want to be the 15th person asking that person.
You certainly
roll
don't.
their eyes and say, leave me alone. I never want to hear about your ministry again. Like you don't want to have that conversation, right?
Yeah, exactly. You want to make sure that through your policy that your staff are cared for. So, because they don't want to be in that situation.
Right.
I've unfortunately been in that situation where I've asked somebody to support me, somebody that I was close to, and they're like, I'd love to support you, Andrew, but I'm already supporting like 3 missionaries, and I've just got asked by a 4th, not including you. And I was like, wow. I was like, yeah, no, that's fair, man. Like I was like, yeah, and I felt really uncomfortable in that situation because I realized that we had not stewarded this alumni of the organization well. And then they kind of had a bit of a sour taste towards the organization, and the organization had walked through them through conversion and through being a missionary disciple and all of that.
Good example.
So it's not about us like kiboshing and throw the kibosh down on who you can ask or not. It's making sure that people are taken care of properly, both the support raiser and.
It's important now and then that we mention that we have a resource available to those who help train and coach others that are raising support. The SRS network really isn't for everyone, but it is for those who are seeking to shape direction, build infrastructure, elevate training, and multiply coaching in their ministry culture. We can provide individual or organizational access to other support-raising resources in order to help you help others who are within your ministry. Learn more at supportraisingsolutions.org/network.
Okay, so we got a little bit off into the weeds here. That was a good side tangent, but back to kind of the question that I intended for us to go towards. Let's try and go back there to you're going on staff with an organization. They have policies. You start to interact with them, and you come across something. You're like, wait a minute. That doesn't seem right. Or wait a minute, we don't have a policy on this. Why isn't there a policy on this? So what do we, and you touched on it, but why don't you give it a little more clarity if you would. What do you do in that situation when you're not sure what to do with either non-existing or unclear policy?
Yeah, for sure. So there's 2 things that I would do in that situation. So if you're unclear on the policy, pick up your phone and call your local, your very friendly MPD coordinator, director, whoever it is that's in charge of that policy, and say, I was looking at the policy and I noticed this. Can you help me to understand it a little bit better?
Right.
Kind of asking to be brought in to the policy about and the reasoning behind it, I think is one of the most crucial things. Because if you approach that person and say, I disagree with this, or this is stupid, well, then my back's up and I'm not going to want to talk to you about it. And I'm going to say, well, that's the way it is, deal with it. But if somebody said to me, hey, I've noticed this, Andrew, that we have this rule. Hey, do you know why we have this rule? Like, is there a particular reason why? Because this is my situation. And then if somebody approaches me like that, I'd be like, oh, no problem. Like, oh, this is why. Like, this is why. Like, this.
So it's a conversation then. It's not an altercation. It's a conversation, and you just might get educated.
Yeah, exactly. And then on the second hand, if you're saying like, okay, there's a policy here, there's not a policy here that needs to be here, I would think like first things first, like, that's awesome. Like, good for you for like discovering a hole in your policy. Like that really does show that that you care about your organization, and B, that you have the critical thinking skills to like notice these kinds of things, and that will serve you very well in leadership in your organization. And so those are great things. And then so what I would say in those situations is highlight the area, and then either send an email to say, hey, I've noticed that there's a gap in policy here. What would you recommend that I do in this circumstance? And kind of just bringing it to the attention of whoever is in charge of that policy, because maybe they're working on a piece of policy, or maybe they're not even like aware of that there's a gap in those situations.
That is a good point, by the way. Sometimes people are put in charge of policing policies that they didn't write, and they don't understand either. And so give them the benefit of the doubt and the grace for you to say, hey, I'm just trying to understand this better. I want to follow the policy. This policy just doesn't make sense to me. Could you explain it? They might be able to go, yeah, I have no idea. Forget that. We're gonna delete that, or they might be like, I'm gonna bring that up, and we'll get that gone by next week, or whatever else. But I think your posture, along with asking respectful questions, is super crucial. And so, just because you see a policy you don't like, that doesn't mean it's the end of the day. You can ask questions and be better informed and know how to move forward, or you might be able to be a part of getting that policy changed, or perhaps even eliminated if it doesn't need to be there, right?
Yeah, and you want to have that posture, because I mean, our policy on MPD is probably 15 pages long, 20 pages long, in that range. And I mean, and it's there's a lot in there, and it's kind of convoluted at times.
Exciting.
Pardon?
I said, that sounds like such an exciting read. I can
you know what?
Curl up by a fireplace and
curl up. It's it's a Saturday night, and I'm printing off the policy to read. No, I mean, it definitely is boring, but I think what reminds me and what helps me stay passionate about my policy is that the better it gets, the better I'm able to care for my staff. And the better I'm able to care for my staff, the more they can see the Father's heart in CCO. And and that's at the end of the day, that's what I want them to see. I want them to see that the Father loves them, and that the organization loves them and wants good thing for them. Like, I want my policy to reflect my Father's heart. By which I mean, there's truth, right? There's truth in the policy, because there are standards that have to be met. Jesus had exacting standards, but also there's grace. And there's grace in the policy as well, to show you that we love you, we care for you, and that, perfection is not always attainable. Right. And you want to have your policy balance in that. And in my interactions as a policy enforcer and a policy writer, that I want to balance those things. And when somebody approaches me and says, and tries to kind of understand why we've thought about this, or why certain things are the way that they are, if they approach me combatively, I mean, I would like to think that I would still approach them with grace. But
Oh, be honest. You're a hockey fan. You'd throw a punch.
Yeah. I think hockey's the only professional sport that they allow fighting in. You just get out for 5 minutes and then you can go back in.
There you go. There you go. 5 minute break.
Yeah,
How much
like
it cost you? And
I'd like to say that I treat people well, and I'm sure there's many holy people in the SRS network that I've met at the conferences, and I know they would treat you well because they're much holier than I. But if somebody kind of approaches me combatively, generally my first reaction is to kind of just write them off or
Right.
ignore their complaints. But if somebody says to me, "Hey, I've noticed that this is here. This is my experience of it. Can you help me just kind of understand why we're doing this?" I mean, I'm much more likely to do that. And then if you even want to go a bit further, and then you could say, I've noticed that there's a gap here. Have you thought about maybe we could do it like this, and kind of even giving a bit of a suggestion to kind of help the person kind of get started rather than just kind of complaining or saying that I don't like this policy.
Right.
Because then you're showing real leadership by saying, like, you're identifying the problem and then you're also kind of trying to provide the solution at hand, so you're not just kind of dumping problems. Like, I know, Aaron, we work with a lot of people, and it's very frustrating when somebody kind of says, "Hey, this is a problem," and then kind of just leaves it there. And you're kind of like,
Right.
"Thanks."
All right. Here's the grenade. I'll let you clean up the mess that I just threw in there. So,
Yeah.
Yeah. People, like, it doesn't mean people can't ask questions, but perhaps don't pound on the table without some, even some questions about or towards potential solutions. And it's quite possible, and this is a good segue, kind of the last thing I wanted to touch on with you today, Andrew. It's quite possible that you may be a part, short but even long term, of creating healthier, better policies for you and your organization. One of our champions in all this, Andrew, as I know you're well aware, is Ellis Goldstein, who he's with Crew, and Ellis helped to come up with a lot of the parameters and policies that Crew has used over the years to help release many globally ministry leaders. And one of the things that they had to do early on is they had to start to determine, what do we expect of people when it comes to having meetings after their support raising training? Like, what do we define as someone who's working full time, trying to move towards being, spiritually healthy, vision driven, fully funded? They might use slightly different terms, but
Yeah.
like, what is our definition? What do we expect of that person during their Monday through Saturday work week? And it took some time to land on some numbers and some good measurables that wasn't just tied into, do they have money yet? No, it wasn't that. It was more like, hey, are they making enough phone calls? Are they getting enough meetings? And at what point do we say, no, they're not? And do we have those conversations like, hey, we thought you were going to be doing this full time. Based upon these numbers, we can tell you're not actually raising support full time. How are we going to move forward from here? It took them a while to get to a place of a policy that now it's easy for them. Well, I don't know if it's easy. I don't want to say that, but it's easier for them to understand and communicate clearly what their expectations are of new staff. And so I think we as I think many of our listeners are probably pretty early on the trail of getting or staying fully funded. I think we need to respect the brothers and sisters that have gone before us and have tried to come up with some policies so that hopefully we can thrive, but also our families and ministries can thrive.
Yeah.
And so policy is not necessarily a bad thing, but Andrews, I'm sure you're well aware, sometimes those policies need to be developed and changed, and that doesn't happen overnight, does it?
No, it certainly doesn't. I mean, policy, like, I don't know how it is in every organization, but policy can generally be a pretty large beast, and I do use that term purposefully because it is a beast most of the time. And I mean, you have to get approval for your changes, but then also when you're making these changes, your policy is very it applies to everyone in your organization. So when you're making a change, you have to think through, okay, if I'm willing to do this for this person, am I going to be willing to do this for every person, for the rest of the organization's time, essentially, until this policy is changed? because you can't say, well, this policy applies to you, but it doesn't apply to you. And so you want to have some grace there, because the policy might be in place, and it might be the reason of, well, they have to apply this certain policy to 100 different people, or in Cru's case, thousands of people. I mean, Cru is a massive organization, and they had to do a lot of work. So I can't even imagine how much work they must have gone through and how long that would take to develop a really good, clear policy around there. And it's so important that as the staff that you recognize that the policy is for everyone. So they can't make special circumstances, because then they would have to make special exceptions for everyone. And that generally there's an approval process. You can't just, somebody can't just generally go in there and say, yeah, I'm going to make this change today. I mean, some people can do that, but some people can. Right. But a lot of the time, your MPD director will have to talk to the president or your executive director, and make sure that they're on board with it too, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that would be facing kind of the consequences of those actions, right? And so in our organization, I propose the policy change, and then our executive ratifies.
Right. So for our listeners, I realize some of you are like, oh, okay, this is too much, man. I'm just trying to raise my support right now. So what we want you to understand is you might have some great, fresh perspective that other people's don't, that within your organization. So don't, just because you have a question about policy, that's not a bad thing. Ask why it's there, and ask how you can, work with it, or around it where you need to, and not be guilty of doing anything that's inappropriate. But understand that it takes time for organizations a lot of times to have great, healthy policy, and it's always dynamic. I think it's always in flux. In fact, I would be probably a little more concerned is if your organization is running from having any sort of healthy policy. In fact, I've seen that recently, Andrew, doing some support raising coaching and stuff. I've ran into a couple of situations where, as I've been talking with people, they have said, well, I don't know about this. And I said, well, your supervisor should know that. Speak with your supervisor. And then I'm getting a phone call from their supervisor going, hey, what should my policy be on this? We don't have this. And I'm like, whoa, okay. there's an organizational issue here that needs to be addressed to help this person raise their support more. So
and to those people, again, I would say there's a conference coming up this upcoming April, and the SRS is putting on, and you'll get a lot of ideas on how to influence policy, and like how to develop that so you can be taking care of your staff.
Yeah, in fact, thank you for mentioning that. The date was currently still scheduled for April of 2021. That's the Support Raising Leaders Conference. Due to COVID, it's possible there could be some changes coming on that. I don't have any formal announcement as of today. That hasn't changed, but we're starting to run into a few different things with Florida and their rules and all that kind of stuff. So we would love to still see everybody in April 2021 in Orlando. If that needs to be changed to the fall or something like that, you need to pay attention to the SRS website. So this is a podcast. At the time you're listening to this, I have no idea when it is, so don't lock us into that. But that conference, I know we plan to have it again and again and again. We're trying to do them every 18 months or so, and it is a wonderful conference specifically for these type of talks for organizational leaders that do have to set policies, and what policies, and how do you do it, and when do you know you're going the wrong direction, and how do you run forward in better directions. That's kind of a dense, you could call it boring, or you could call it exciting topic. Some of that depends on what your job is and what you're passionate about in ministry. But Andrew, I think you have done a great job of not disparaging policy on this podcast, but helping people understand why it's actually a good thing. They shouldn't run from it. Instead, they should read it, they should get informed about it, and they should put it into practice. And yes, respectfully question it when it doesn't make sense. That's going to help make them that much more likely to be spiritually healthy, vision-driven, fully funded, Great Commission workers. So with that being said, I think we've reached the end of our podcast. As is my habit, though, Andrew, I like to invite the guest to kind of have the last final word on the topic. So I am going to punt that towards you, my friend, before we close.
Oh, thanks, Aaron. Yeah, I would say, to our listeners, Your policy and your interactions with it can really make or break your call in your organization. If you treat it respectfully and you treat the people who kind of created it respectfully and lovingly, your call in your ministry is going to go well. If you're combative and you're fighting with it, it's going to be really hard for you to be involved, engaged in your organization, because it's just going to be a fight from day one. I guess the thing I would say is that if you want to make your organization better, get informed and take ownership over your policy, because it's still your policy because you're in the organization. Right. And if you want to change things for the better, good, do that. You can do that. We kind of gave you some steps on how to do that, and know that by doing that, you're making it so that other people don't have to go through the trials or challenges that you had to go through.
Yep. Well, good word, my friend. Andrew Nobauer, thank you so much for joining us once again on the SRS podcast. It's been wonderful to have you speak some words of wisdom to us today.
Oh, pleasure to be here.
Thanks for joining us for this episode. We would love to hear your ideas for future content. Please visit supportraisinSolutions.org/feedback to share your thoughts and questions. Also, wherever you download your podcast from, be sure to subscribe for future episodes and come back each week to gain more insight into the process of building and maintaining your personal support team.